Welcome everybody today to the Lunch and Learn. We're talking about paper, particularly book publishing paper and the current state of the market. Our invited guest is John Crumbaugh from Hewlett HP Inc. rather. And with the help of Ashley Gordon, who's a significant volunteer for us in the several of our committees, particularly supply chain and sustainability. She asked John if he might weigh in and talk a little bit about his experience. We are recording this webinar. That's not unusual for us in terms of our overall webinars, but our Lunch and Learns have kind of been in the past off the record, but we have found a lot of people with conflicts have asked us to at least record it. It will be posted at shortly after this meeting concludes. The format of the Lunch and Learn, if you've not attended before, is really informal. It's in the spirit of a Lunch and Learn. So John's going to talk for a little bit, kind of give a perspective on North American and European paper markets. And from there, we're going to both ask him some questions and take your comments and questions. If you could, while he's speaking and after, to add a comment to the chat, we'll be monitoring that and we'll use that as a way to pick it up. And as I've said, to John and you might have experienced directly. If it's a longer comment or it's something you have a perspective on, we might just ask you to unmute yourself and try to join in the conversation. But with that as background, John, thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciate you making the time and also preparing some materials for us.
That looks good for marked man. Thank you, Paul.
And just a brief reminder before John starts that if you are having some background noise and you're not muted, please mute yourself. So John, take it away.
Hi, thanks for having me. First of all, my name is John Crumbaugh. I've been with HP, working in the paper side of the HP business for 6 years now. And prior to that, I've been in the inkjet paper business for an additional 6 years. So I've learned enough about paper in the inkjet world to have some thoughts on it. Certainly, anyone that calls themselves an expert in paper today, it's changing so fast that expertise rapidly becomes outdated. So I'll go through where we see the market from a HP Media and Supplies perspective. Just a quick word on media and supplies. HP is a huge company. And certainly we have the a group that manufactures the equipment that you see here in front of you, servicing the for actual printing. I work for a different group within HP that actually works with the paper mills, sourcing paper from everything from consumer desktops all the way up through commercial printing devices. So we're deeply involved in the paper industry at HP. But probably from a different perspective than someone from, say, a paper merchant or a paper mill would be. So, what I bring to the party may be a little different than what you've heard in the past, but I'll do my best with it. Okay, some themes that we're seeing, and I'm going to talk very high level themes because I think they're going to get some conversation going because I'm sure you all see themes a little differently, or maybe you're being impacted from it. But one of the big themes is down there at the bottom. They're kind of derby monsters there. The graphic paper industry, and by that I'm speaking specifically graphic printing papers, as opposed to the larger paper industry, which tends to get talked about with packaging and tissue paper and all the things that get made that are paper. But what's happened really going into the pandemic and through the pandemic up through really as we speak, our industry is going through just really historical changes. So any forecast that we hear about our industry, I take it as an educated guess based on what people know. I don't think anyone has a crystal ball. Certainly, they didn't see last year coming. We went from the 2022, which was one of the steepest rebounds in paper in history. The mills all had record years as far as their profitability goes, and then immediately was followed by 2023, which certainly in North America and Europe was the worst year in history, with a decline of 28%. And yes, there was inventory positions and all sorts of things going on, but really the main thing is demand. demand, this is a volume-based business. And so anything that affects demand affects volume. And, mills are huge volume producers, and therefore turning one off is not a lightweight exercise. Two things I thought were really important to bring up is, the graphic paper capacity. Because if this happened in any other industry, say automotive, or pretty much steel, anything else, it would be, national news. I find in paper, since it's kind of all white and looks the same, a lot of people don't really, outside of those close to the industry, realize how big an impact we've had recently. So in 2018, from 2018 to 2023, 50% of North American paper capacity in graphic arts is gone. It's converted to packaging, it's gone away, it's closed, machine's been shut down, it's moved into specialty. The result of that is we have a relatively stable paper market in North America here in 2024. Europe is about to go through what we just did. So Europe, it's forecast, of course, take forecast with a grain of salt, but based on the overcapacity, and you'll see that a little bit later, between 2023 and 2028, there's a strong chance that 75% of the capacity in Europe will be eliminated. That's a shocking number. We're talking 3 to 4 million tons. So, what's it all mean? Hopefully I'll get to some of that a little bit further because it does impact what we do. Some things that are happening right now that are impacting what's going on, what's happening in the Red Sea. We're seeing more imports to North America because it's just harder to get paper from Europe, which is a big exporter, around to Asia. So it's coming into the North American markets. We're seeing some record highs as far as imports into this market, which of course is affecting price and availability and trends that way. Market pulp, it's going up. That's never a good thing for paper pricing. The Port of Baltimore, which I grew up right there, shocking to see that bridge come down, but that was a major actual paper import spot into North America. There were several European mills that bring their paper in through there, accounting for about $1 billion a year into that port. So it's a significant amount of paper that is now, at least temporarily, won't be able to come in through there. And then, of course, the strikes going on in Finland. There's some short-term closures there as well. Hopefully, they don't turn into long-term closures because that'll impact both marketplaces. So uncoated free sheet, and these pictures, these are RISI, which is one of these services that we use. Lots of people use them to get data. They seem to be pretty accurate for the information that they get. But North American free sheet operating rates, and of course operating rates, that's what's going to dictate the availability of paper, but also pricing. They're getting up close to 90%. So that's a healthy paper market from a paper mill standpoint. Which really is good for everybody because that means paper's available. Mills are stable. They're not going out of business. They're not closing. So we have a fairly stable paper market for uncoated free sheet as a whole. Different grades are different, but prices are also going up. So we've seen, that recently announced 5 to 7% increase by practically every North American manufacturer. But we're also seeing that across the board from some Asian manufacturers as well as a lot of the European manufacturers. So pricing is going to go up, and the closer we get to 90, the more likely that price is to go up and hold because the mills are full. Sorry, fumbling with my slides a little bit. Coated free sheet's a little different. The coated free sheet market, it dropped 38% in 2023. And of course, this is divided up between, free sheet and coated mechanical. But you can see the operating rates on these are pretty bad. They're down below 80%. They need to be up around 90 for these to be healthy mills. Sappi's made an announcement, saying that they're going to, convert Somerset. That's going to take that, piece of the pie a little bit smaller for Sappi. But what's dramatic here, and I think ties back to that first picture of the 50% reduction is there's not a lot of players left in coated paper in North America. I mean, you have two very, very large participants. You have WestRock, which really is a board stock manufacturer. So it for most publishing, it doesn't count. Nine Dragons, which is a you know, Chinese participant, and then basically Willamette out on the West Coast is the only West Coast provider still available. So very, very small number of participants, and as you can imagine, the fewer the participants, the more things tend to price up because of that. So coated mechanical, this is probably very important on the publishing side. A lot of coated mechanical paper used. Of course, it's also used in magazines and catalogs, which is driving a lot of behavior because it's so much. This is one that's kind of a wild card. There's only 4 paper machines left in North America that are producing coated mechanical paper. What this means is, as you can see, the operating rates are very, very low. Demand is also low for these grades. So there's a strong likelihood that someone is going to shut a mill down, probably by 2026 at the latest. If that happens, we're going to go from a position where today prices are fairly flat to slightly falling to prices are going to shoot up dramatically because we're going to go from a position where operating rates are relatively low to they're very high. It's because there's so few players left in the market. When any one of them leaves, changes, or load shares their mill, that impact is magnified. It's just there's fewer to take up the slack. This is happening across the board in the U.S., and we're going to see it. This is just going to accelerate over time. Europe's next. So here's a picture of Europe. That's why I say it's Europe's next in this cycle. I just put 2024 on there in case it was hard to see on the screens. That's just my line. But the rest of the graph, really what it's showing here is demand continues to fall. As that demand falls, there's excess capacity. And when that excess capacity comes out, that's what this next slide shows, is the green is the capacity, but the orange is the demand or what's being produced and sold. So in this case, there's way more capacity than there is to demand, and that is going to right size over time, as you can see with the black line. That's certainly the mill's hope and intention. This taking this much out at a single time is going to have impacts that are felt. Probably won't be felt as much in pricing as in certain SKUs and certain products will become unavailable. We've seen this recently with Sappi in Europe. They closed their coated mills or some of their coated mills, and some of those made unique products. The mill in Belgium, it makes some fairly unique products. When that shuts, that product just goes away completely. It's no longer available to the market. So as this happens, some of the products that we are used to using may become unobtainable. Some may shift to other mills. And of course, paper being a natural product, they're just like furniture or wood or anything else. Sometimes you can shift to another mill and that paper will maintain the same properties and it'll still act the same and respond the same when you print to it, but sometimes not. So volatility is going to become the norm in Europe as these mills are removed from the system, much like it was in the U.S. It's not a huge deal, but it's something that everybody's going to have to deal with. And certainly in the inkjet space, it is a big deal for those who are printing on inkjet equipment. And then this is my last slide, really. It's kind of major changes in an adapting industry. Paper, everybody likes to think of the paper mills as the bad guys, and I kind of like to too sometimes, but really, they're just adapting to their business that is changing extremely fast. Trends that were happening pre-pandemic were accelerated just like they were in everybody's business. But paper manufacturing, due to the scale of their business, it's an industry that was scaled for 2005. I mean, that was the peak of paper production. in US and Europe. And very large machines, very efficient. And now as the market gets smaller and smaller, some of those things are not necessarily advantages. So, producers are being very careful trying to manage demand. They don't want to end up in a situation like they were in 2023, where so much paper was sold that there's an inventory out there and they're having to fight inventories on people's shelves. So they're managing inventories much more carefully, as are the merchants and distributors, what we understand. Some products are starting to go to make only, and we're going to see more of this based on mill schedules, especially mills who were producing specialty products on the same equipment that they traditionally only did graphics on. They're now load sharing across the same paper machine. Short-term paper machine shutdowns. This is something that is, I would say, new. There's always been the maintenance shutdowns that mills do, every year, especially during the summertime when things are slow, they'll do a shutdown. We're going to see those shutdowns get longer. And the reason is they're trying to base production to demand. And in the past, that was also often done with pricing. Today, the pricing isn't really going down in relationship to the operating rates. It's a new phenomenon because the mills are holding their prices. So we're going to see more stable pricing to rising pricing. That's the forecast from everything I've seen through 2028. There'll be some ups and downs as normal, but the days of 2019 paper, they're truly history and will never come back, is our expectation. One of the big things is input cost. They're continuing to go up for mills. And it's more than just the pulp pricing, which is a commodity. And of course, it goes up and down based on how much pulp's being made at any given spot. This is more to the core of their business across multiple input chemistries, labor. It's costing them more to make paper, and they're looking at it from a profitability standpoint, and they're deciding as the mills, do we keep making paper for graphic arts, or do we start moving paper for specialty tea bags? There's a lot of things a paper machine can do besides make graphic arts paper. So the mills, there's actually more paper made today. This was kind of shocking to me, just to go off on a weird tangent, but there's more paper made today in 2024 than there was in 2018. It's just not graphic arts paper. So it's kind of interesting concept, I think, looking at it from a paper company's standpoint. The higher cost for paper, this is the downside for us in the printing industry is, this creates a negative cycle. As paper pricing goes up, paper demand drops. Mills look at that and say, ooh, we have too much capacity. We're going to have to remove some capacity. And this creates a negative cycle because when the capacity is pulled out, the prices go up and we start the cycle again. So this is a negative cycle that is ongoing right now. Some grades, like I mentioned, the coated mechanical in North America, we're down to the last 4 mills in operation. In this particular case, and the reason I call it out is any company that shuts this mill is effectively getting out of the coated mechanical business. Each mill only has, or each owner only has 1 mill in production making this product. So this would be a complete exit from the market for them. That's the wild card to watch, I think, for in the short term. And then mills are realizing that inkjet is starting to really have an impact on their offset businesses. It's an interesting time for that in that there is an increasing focus and awareness of mills on inkjet. But the values that we see at HP around inkjet are very different than a mill's outlook on this. Mills like to sell high volumes of, paper that are maybe lower value for the finished good, so more produced. As the finished good becomes more valuable, the total volume drops. And of course, we are in an industry that was built for 2005. So the scale of the industry is outsized to the demand at the moment. So inkjet's a little bit of a conundrum for the mills. They see a focus on it. They like it because it justifies higher prices because it's a higher value product. but at the same time, digital is a different scale than offset for the industry. So it's an interesting time for very adapting industry. We're going to see this adaptation. It's going to continue to get tighter and tighter as the industry adapts. So interesting times for paper. Not necessarily bad, just interesting. And that's all I have from a presentation standpoint.
Well, thank you for that, John. And we have a few questions to get us started, and maybe I could start with the question. Would you be willing to share your slides after this presentation?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
All right, great. So
I'll send them to you after the call.
thanks. And Madeline had asked the question, and we'll get those out along with the recording once we're able to upload it to YouTube. One question that came in right as you were talking about your experience or your knowledge of the Baltimore port and its significant role that it plays in imports of paper. The question is more shipping than paper, but what prevents or what gets in the way of moving those shipments from Baltimore to another port for paper imports? And I think there's a complexity with vessels kind of coming into ports unannounced. Is that correct?
So it's vessels coming into ports unannounced, and it's paper roll handling is very specialized. It's different than other cargoes, much like Port of Baltimore with auto. Auto is you have to have a place to put the car when it rolls off the roll on, roll off. Same with paper. There has to be a warehouse for it. There has to be the proper equipment to move that paper around the warehouse. That can all be done, but it's shifting it to another port that may be farther away. Generally, most of the paper companies that I work with will have multiple ports of entry, so that will happen. They'll shift to the more southern ports or shift to the port of New York, but it's going to take time to move those into position, and then there's going to be an additional cost because generally they bring the paper in to the closest port to distribute it. So it's going to be a bobble. I don't think it's going to be a huge deal, but it will be a little bit of bobble, and it could add additional cost into these importers.
And we've had a different lunch and learn conversation with Jason Farrell from the University of Toronto Press, talking about essentially freight in the North American market, and just getting trucks to the right place at the right time is also a concern. So it's not simply the case of getting it off the container ship, but also having the vehicles in place to take it where it needs to be. A follow-up question on that, this from Andrew. You talked a little bit about the current kind of push for higher prices, particularly in certain grades that increase. Is this something I think you've said clearly that in the course of your remarks that this increased price pressure and volatility around pricing will probably continue over the foreseeable future. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. Everything that we can see, we watch this very, very carefully, as you can imagine, indicates that pricing is going to be relatively stable. So I don't think we're going to see these huge swings that we've seen, in 2021 through 2023. That said, the pricing, all indications are that pricing will be stable to increasing. So while it's a commodity, so there's going to be slight dips and rises, but the overall trend is up, and that's across basically every grade. Will continue to rise.
Yeah, and it's because I work for a trade association, it's probably important to say that we don't exercise influence or project, but the prices are negotiated between trading partners, but it's it's your opinion in this case that
Absolutely.
The operating mechanics of the marketplace will play a role there. This might, to back you up a little bit, but it might be a useful thing for a lot of people on the call. Emily from Book Ops, which is a significant operating arm in the New York Public Library system, was just asking, if you could give examples from the different categories like coated mechanical and coated free of what the product is, what markets it serves, so and we tend to work in books, so maybe start there.
Sure, absolutely. We do a lot of books too, so that's actually a nice, comfortable place to start.
Right.
So coated mechanical, certainly the grades that are used in books, the higher PPI products and things like that, they take a little bit more effort to produce because of the PPI, and the caliper control. So, they certainly are ones that we will see continue to go up in price. In the North American model today, pretty flat, but due to the demand that has come out from magazines and catalogs, it's the same it's the same physical paper machine making those products. And because that demand has dropped, there's a high likelihood that one of those paper machines, and meaning one of those companies in the North American market, will exit. If they do, the operating rates are going to shoot right up there to that level where the paper companies like to be. It's their most profitable level. And so we're going to see stable pricing go to much steeper pricing. Today, they can't justify it because there's just an oversupply of paper. But when that paper supply gets tighter, which high likelihood it will, and it'll do so very, very suddenly, all kind of overnight, all at once, we're going to see price increases. That would be my forecast. If I were forecasting, just because we're going to go from 4 producers, adding to the pie, to 3 producers, and when you shut a paper machine off, you can't kind of slow it down. It's all or nothing. So it's 300, 400,000 tons being removed from the market immediately. They don't ramp down. It just doesn't work that way.
And
now there's imports.
What the coated mechanical would typically be for a magazine or a catalog?
Or potentially, higher education books could be using, coated mechanical. I know some of those are produced that way. Workbooks often use mechanical grades, and there's been a move, from free sheet to mechanical due to cost. There's some producers are using, and they're usually the better quality mechanical being used as opposed to the low end, the ground wood. There's a lot of alternative offset being produced, which is basically a higher bright mechanical grade, so maybe a number 4 type of grade as opposed to the traditional number 5. But these are all being made on the same paper equipment.
And is it fair to say that most book papers of the sort that we would use either for offset or inkjet are not coated, or are they?
Correct. Correct. Most will not be coated for offset or inkjet, and the uncoated mechanical, there's a good bit of that left. That they're not in that same position of 4 mills. The producers of uncoated mechanical have quite a few mills, but up in Canada and northern North America, northern U.S. So that's in a completely different, more stable state as far as production and consumption.
Mark is asking, what's played a larger part in the capacity reduction? You talked about a 50% reduction between 2018 and 2023. Is it mill closures, or is it shifting to something other than graphic paper? Are we losing mills, or are we losing graphic paper capacity?
So as it went in the U.S., and I suspect Europe will track very similarly, the mills who can convert to packaging, whether that's box board or container board, they will. That means there's a market for it. What happened in the U.S. is that's a saturated market now. Everybody kind of follows the herd, it seems like, in the paper business. It's they don't collude, but they sure seem to all do the same thing in the same, they're reading the same, I guess, forecast. So boxboard right now is fairly saturated globally. There's a oversupply of container board and folding carton material. So my guess is we'll see more mills that just shut this go round, because the opportunity to convert it is not quite as robust as it used to be. And we'll see older equipment. There's a lot of, in the North American market, what's kind of surprising is, the average mechanical age of this equipment, it's in the 70s, 80s, 90s. A lot of this equipment was installed before I was born, literally, and I'm not young. um, so some of these machines are old. They've been updated technically, but they're not the most optimum things in the world. So some of the older equipment just was retired, basically. In Europe, there's some newer equipment in Europe. I suspect those will be the ones that convert, and the older, smaller, non-integrated mills will be the ones that shut.
And maybe building on Mark's question, he asked specifically about the US, but what's driving that 75% reduction in Europe? Is it just more of same of what you just described for the US, or do they have specific, for example, is EUDR, the European Directive on paper sustainability, playing a role? Are there other things that play?
I don't believe that sustainability is playing a role. Most of these things have been planned out farther in advance. What happened? So it's beginning in, say, 2017, the U.S. went through several mill closures. There was also a ramp up in boxboard demand, so converting was more exciting, I guess. It was more lucrative. So there was a lot of conversions took place in North America, and several bankruptcies took place. And then we hit the pandemic, and those continued during that time period as demand for everything plummeted. Some mills just shut at that point, or decided, we're going to close this facility. Or like Georgia Pacific, they just decided we're just not going to be in the graphic arts at all anymore, and we're going to focus on the packaging side of the house. That didn't occur in Europe for many reasons. So instead of right sizing their markets as we did in North America, where demand and supply were fairly well balanced, in Europe they took a wait and see approach. We're going to just hold off, and a lot of this has to do with labor contracts in Europe being more difficult to break than the U.S. and things like that. But we're starting to see it with the Rotogravure plants first in Europe. They're Plattling shut. Lecta shut the Condent one paper machine there. The Sappi divestitures, Stora Enso getting out. So it's starting to happen, but it's going to happen over a shorter amount of time because there was so much built up capacity that was not taking out of the system. So it's going to be a little bit more dramatic when it comes out. So it's just kind of delayed.
We've got a couple of questions on sustainability, and I recognize that we didn't bring you in as a sustainability expert. You have
And I'm not.
Yeah, but are there anything, do you have a perspective on, this is from Josh, with respect to recycled papers or hemp or bamboo-based alternative fiber solutions? I mean, are they potentially either even viable or replacements for, and are mills kind of engaging in these topics, or is it still kind of on the periphery?
I think from things, alternative fibers are still in the periphery. And part of it's the same reason, whether it's a tree or it's bamboo or it's wheat chaff or straw, they're all farmed products. And most of the Western Europe and North American mills, quite a few of the Latin American mills are highly sustainable in how they're producing their farmed fiber sources. Asia's a little bit different. There's certainly some still bad actors out there, but for the most part, the major mills they're heavily focused on sustainability because it's good business. And that's why they're doing it. Certainly, if it wasn't good business, who knows what people would do? Maybe they do the right thing, but in major Western markets, the participants are really focused on sustainable harvest, things like FSC, PEFC. They're proud of what they're doing. One of the major pulp manufacturers in Latin America, has stated that 100% of our fiber is FSC, PEFC, WWF certified. So there is a trend to do the right thing. I think it's just being driven by the overall business climate as opposed to any specific directive. I don't think the industry seems to be that nimble as the directives are.
And there was a comparable question from a different participant today about, to what extent is the specific mention was FSC certification play into the manufacturing on paper and pricing. I think part of that is driven by what the market's looking for. So increasingly, if publishers are looking for SFI or FSC or any other certification, that's kind of the magnet that pulls the metal filings toward it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they know who's buttering their bread. And, if it's important to the publishers, it becomes important to the paper manufacturers. We see that in Europe, but just in the rhetoric, between Europe and the US, it's more important in Europe, and therefore we hear more people talking about it. In the US, less important, we hear less talk about it. So I think that's absolutely true. I did see a question come up around, inventory positions. Realistically, the pre-buying of paper, it's a risk. I think the important thing is really staying on top of what's happening with whoever you're purchasing your paper from, and having them, have a good relationship with them. This is what I tell our, individual printers quite often is, the days, 2016 previous, where people used to hop merchant to merchant, shopping for a deal here, shopping from a deal there. That's not a good strategy in a condensed paper market, because we will eventually get back to allocations. And when that happens, those who have good relationships and, have been consistently buying will get the allocations. That's just the way the paper industry works. And those who shop around could get caught out. I don't think there's any worry about that in 2024, 2025, but we will get back there again. And I always tell my individual printers is, have good relationships, trying to save $1 here and $1 there. In the long term, if you get caught out, it's far more damaging to the business.
Sure, and caught out can be either the paper is not available, or the particular grade or SKU that you want is not available.
Exactly. Yeah. This is where relationships start to matter more and more.
There was I'm going to stay with sustainability just for a moment and come back to a question about overall market dynamics. So Chris was just asking about EUDR, the European Union Deforestation Regulation. And he's just wondering, do you think this is going to have an impact on the willingness of paper companies to continue to either produce or ship paper to Europe or into the EU specifically, not just Europe?
Probably not. Like you say, most of the fiber coming into Europe is sustainably sourced and traceable. I think that's going to become more and more important, the traceability of the fiber. So things like chain of custody becoming just part of how paper is moved around. Certainly, the Nordic countries are going to continue to harvest their trees sustainably as they have. I don't think that's a major industry for these companies. I mean, it's billions and billions of gross national product for these countries. Fiber coming out of Mozambique and things like that, in Africa that's coming in. Now that's Red Sea's a bit of a trouble right now, but those forests are going to continue to be managed. They're going to still watch the eucalyptus fiber coming into the to the southern tier producers. So I think it becomes more important. I think more companies, HP, we are getting tighter and tighter on what we require. Certainly our HP paper must be sustainably sourced and proven. So I think as more companies of our size weigh in and say, hey, this is a must for us, it's not a we'd like it, that's going to force more of the good behavior that we see. But the reality is, without trees, and I will say I'm a little biased, but without managed forest, that land doesn't have much value. So it's going to be used for something else. So at a certain level, a managed forest that's producing, paper that becomes books is a pretty positive cycle, as opposed to, electronic waste or something else that gets that land use. I mean, if that land is not making money, the corporations who own it will repurpose the land. Think of it here in in North America, how many of our forests in the South, New York State, are owned by paper companies? It's a tremendous amount of forests that today is, giving positive contribution, that if that stops, because paper use is curtailed, that land's going to do something else. So I think there are some, I'm not a sustainability expert. I wouldn't even claim to be. But I do see companies like HP, we take sustainability extremely seriously. It's in pretty much every presentation that's given at HP, and it's part of our core beliefs and requirements. So we're going to see more of that, more pressure to do things right.
And we were part actually of a session that HP sponsored ahead of London Book Fair. Ashley Gordon arranged it, and the sustainability was a core part of the conversation throughout the day. One of the things that came up there, and I heard it again at the book fair itself, is a concern with data gathering and reporting, which is depending on who you ask, it's somewhere between complicated and onerous. But our feeling is we're BISG is part of what's called the Green Book Alliance, a consortium of BookNet Canada, BIC in the UK, which has a really significant sustainability focus on its own, and BISG. And we're thinking that maybe we need to play a role in talking about what that reporting and data gathering looks like and how to make it work better for the industry. So
just a comment on that, from a forestry standpoint, today, if you buy, a thing of romaine lettuce at your local Publix, they can trace that back to the field it was grown in the Central Valley.
Right.
So when we talk about it being onerous, I think that's an area where the paper industry may be blowing a little smoke, because if they can do it for a head of romaine lettuce, they're back to the row and the people who picked it. I'm sure they can do it for a managed forest that takes 30 to 50 years to grow. So, how hard is it really to do that reporting? I think that's an area where maybe there should be less pushback than there really is. That's just my personal opinion. But
sure.
Just
and
comparing.
An observation I made while in London was simply that anytime you change the reporting expectations, there's going to be a learning curve, because you need data that hasn't been gathered for that purpose or in that form. So making it clear, I think would probably make it possible to then start to solve the head of lettuce problem. So
I think, as we begin to more and more printing closer to the end user, who's consumer, that gets easier and easier too. Today, a lot of printing is done internationally, so that tracking is, by its nature, very difficult. As we start to print closer and closer to the consumer, that the supply chains get tighter as well, and easier to record.
right. So, well, we haven't solved it just yet. I'm only back a couple of weeks from London, so, but we are thinking about it, and we may do something at Frankfurt in the fall. I skipped over a couple of questions I just want to come back to. One from Lynn was just talking about recovered paper as furnished, specifically, is there still solid demand for that? I think this is the trim and the essentially white unprinted paper that would be, I think the answer is there is it's still pretty solid demand.
That's a question I don't know the answer for. I know that from a recycling of paper, certainly there are some producers who are highly focused, like Sustain Up and the St. Jerome mill, that are very focused on that. Certain European manufacturers, it does seem like recyclable paper doesn't seem to be growing. That's an area of paper manufacturing I don't see a lot of growth in, as the overall industry is contracting. And I think it's due to cost. recycled paper is more expensive in most cases to produce um, than a virgin fiber product. So I think that's as costs have risen for paper. They've almost doubled in some, for some SKUs for paper, since 2018. The demand seems to be sinking for recycled because no one wants to pay that extra cost on top of what they're already paying for paper. So that's an area that I do not see any growth in at this moment.
Okay, thanks for that. This is more of a market question, with respect to supply and demand. That there's one person's observing that print is rising. I mean, the demand for print is rising in the potentially in the US market, though not necessarily at the levels that we experienced in 2020. Does that have any impact on capacity, or is there any potential of a mill reopening for a particular graphic arts paper, or do you think that ship has sailed?
I think the ship sailed, and I'll kind of point to Domtar's recent closure of the Ashdown mill, or announcement they're closing Ashdown. That mill began pre-pandemic, had started to convert over to making, I think it's fluff pulp is what that one was doing. They actually brought it back in 2022 because there was so much demand for uncoated free sheets of all grades, and now they're putting it back. So that was one of the very few times I've ever seen a paper machine actually repurposed back into graphic arts. So it can happen. It does happen. I don't see a trend there. Even this year, for the first 3 months of the year, overall paper demand it's rising from where it was in 2023. But remember, that was the all-time low. And it's rising by about 1% realistically over the last 3 months. So while we're seeing a gain, we're hoping it's about 4% for the year, there's still excess capacity. They can easily absorb the 4%, assuming we get to that level of growth, which we all hope we do, because that means more printing's taking place. But I don't see paper machines converting back to graphic arts in the foreseeable future.
And if it happens, we'll invite you back and you can.
I'd love to be wrong there.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be one that would feel really good to be completely wrong about.
Yeah, I mean, these are, if I have the scale right, these are billion-dollar decisions, are they not?
At least.
Yeah. For a paper machine at scale, at least, to build out the facility and replace the equipment.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say getting a paper mill approved in North America or Europe for a greenfield, I don't believe that's even possible any longer due to just all the environmental rules that have been put in place since these were originally built. I don't think there's been a greenfield mill built since the 80s.
Right. So we're kind of a bummer there, but we'll work with it and see what happens.
There's plenty of brownfields out there to keep and convert. So there's still places. Let's hope.
I'm just going to circle back to a comment that Simon Crump, who does quite a bit of the work on sustainability for BIC in the UK, added that he just notes that EUDR, the deforestation regulation, requires the geolocation of trees, much as you were describing, John, the head of lettuce problem. And there's at least an estimate that this would drive a need for up to 300,000 pieces of data for one title. So, I mean, that may be in the bucket of, we can figure it out for one industry. Let's figure out how to apply that solution to the book business. But it's at least that's the initial reaction.
I think that will happen eventually. I think it'll have to happen. And I think, this is, well, I'm not an AI expert at even the slightest bit. I'm more analog. But this is a place where AI can really help. That's huge amounts of data processing. That's where AI can help, is that's continuing to grow. Certainly in the food industry, it's already having major impacts. To port that over to trees, I mean, it's a crop, no different than asparagus would be. The only one benefit we have with that crop is, asparagus gets planted several times a year. These, depending on where you're at in the world, it's either 12 years at a minimum in something like Brazil, or it's going to be, 40 years in the Nordic countries for that tree to be harvested. So knowing where it is, it's not going anywhere for at least 12 years. So, I think that should be a manageable goal, I think.
Thanks. And, trees are taller than asparagus, at least the ones that I have encountered.
Yeah, they don't move
Um,
around a lot.
We just have a few minutes left. I wanted to at least draw you into one BISG specific thing. So we've talked a lot about standardizing paper grades and of paper in particular. It's something that's come up as well with the Book Manufacturers Institute, which is akin to it's the manufacturing arm of the book business in the North American market. And what do you think that does that have potentially a benefit in managing demand? I mean, if we got to a smaller set of SKUs to for both what publishers would print on and what they would order, does that help in this turbulent market or potentially turbulent market?
I think it's going to happen regardless. As the overall capacity shrinks, the mills that are making are going to make the SKUs that are most profitable for them. So I think and we've already seen this, happen several times. I think you're also going to see, as technologies, inkjet, which used to be a fringe technology, as an infant technology, it's now more than mainstream. And we're going to see the mills making SKUs that are tailored for that, just like we did. I'm not old enough, but I know people who are. When things went from letterpress to offset, we saw that occur. We saw a SKU reduction. We saw more specialization. Then offset came. It proliferated out, and you got lots of different SKUs. We're now seeing the same thing beginning in inkjet as that technology becomes more mainstream. So we're going to see that. This is a natural progression that's happened throughout history as technologies change. But since we are in a shrinking business, certain mills are going to be better at making 5 or 6 grades, and as there's less mills, there's going to be less grades. So it's going to happen to us regardless, whether we want it to or not. It already has to a certain extent.
Yeah, it sounds like we also should be encouraging conversations that make sure that for the grades and basis weights that we most care about, that there's clear communication about why we care about them and should try and preserve capacity to create them.
I think keeping scale. If there's certain grades that are super important to the book industry, which I know there are, and working with the mills to, if more is funneled to that's volume is what controls cost in paper making. So if there's 15 different SKUs, they're all going to cost more than if there's 5 SKUs.
Right.
Because just the economies of scale and, the longer they stay in a SKU, the less expensive each ton of that SKU produced is.
So one last question for you, and I know you're not a sustainability expert, so we won't ask you
Not at
that.
all.
But you mentioned at one point during your initial remarks that, the Finland seeing, labor action and strikes and therefore reducing capacity. I got to tell you, Finland was not on my radar before this lunch and learn. How do you as somebody interested in the marketplace keep up? What do you look for? Where do you get your information? Because I think everybody here would love to hear more about, how to at least be aware of what's going on in the market.
So 2 things. One, I cheat. I subscribe to, or HP subscribes to a data service called Rizzy Data. There's some others out there
Right.
that certainly provides a lot of information, trends, things about the paper industry. And then I spent a lot of time reading news stories that are basically, I have a bunch of mills that I'm constantly searching what new press releases are they putting out? The European Forest and Paper Association, the American Forest and Paper Association, they're regularly putting out press releases on, how much paper is being used each month. So it's a readily available. Most of that I mean, the RISI data we pay a lot for, I'm sure, but it's a data source. But most of the data I get is actually commercially available on the internet. I just have searches set up, and whenever, say, SAPI puts out a press release, I get a ping saying, "Hey, there's news out there." So those are the best ways to get information. Really, is the major mills that you work at. Just set up some, notifications in your news feed so that whenever they put out a press release, they'll ping it, because most of them are publicly traded, so they're going to put out press releases on a pretty regular basis to keep their investors aware of what's going on.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the direction. It's certainly something that we need to spend more time thinking about, and even if it's just by being more in touch with our partners, including HP, that's a good way to go about it. Madeline's just adding that vendors can be great at
Absolutely.
providing info. So
Absolutely, most of them are very happy to share information on this because it impacts their day to day.
yeah, and Jill O'Neill has been kind enough to found a Reuters link to an article about Finland. So my data gap will be closing. So, John, thank you for the time today. Thank you as well to Ashley Gordon for having helped put us in touch with you. And we look forward to having you back in the not too distant future to either talk about how you're right or acknowledge that the market's even better than you thought it would be.
That's what I'm hoping for. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks for all the great questions. It makes me think about things I need to go learn a little bit more about or dig into a little bit more as well.
Perfect. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
You too.